And we have got about 13 and a half minutes of the show left. So let's rush through, and we've got the last two interviews for the day. First up is Muzi Siyaya. He is a Group Business Development Executive at GIBB Engineering and Architecture. He joins us on the line. Muzi, good evening.
Good evening, Godfrey, and good evening to your listeners.
So you have written about, I think, a subject that every serious-minded person talks about, thinks about, and puts their thoughts together. So let's get yours around growing long-term black-owned businesses. Just give me the main ideas that you think are key for us to be able to achieve this.
Okay, look, Godfrey, I think the article really stems from my concern that almost all our policy interventions recently seem to focus on SMMEs. And I'm saying that's right. I mean, SMMEs are crucial to growing any economy. But I think there's a disproportionate focus on developing SMMEs at the extent of thinking big, of developing large, big SA businesses, specifically black-owned, that could take on the world. That's really the issue. And part of what I'm raising is a policy vacuum that currently exists, specifically with allowing for growth at all stages of a black-owned company. So you take a small company, you give it a project, then what happens after that? And I think we must run a parallel process. We must create a balance.
So what are you proposing? Are you proposing that there be a deliberate attempt to create big black-owned businesses at the beginning, rather than have these businesses grow organically or through other whatever strategies they choose?
Look, organic growth is always important. But I'm saying there should be intervention. There should be intervention at all stages of that organic growth. There shouldn't be a policy vacuum. All our policies at the moment are saying we want to develop small companies. Anybody below the benefit threshold is happy to stay there because there's tax exemptions, there's access to market, there's all sorts of things that accrue to small-owned businesses. Yet, once you grow above that benefit threshold, which is currently, I think, around 50 million, you're pretty much on your own. And what that does is that it unintentionally creates a small company mentality amongst black people.
Okay, so let's talk about those policies that are required to grow these big businesses that you're talking about. Okay,
look, for a start, I mean, our policy environment is currently fragmented at the moment. So we do have one that somehow seeks to try and create a big business, and it's called the Black Industrialization Policy, but it's specifically focused on manufacturing. So what I'm proposing is really around the state's ability to leverage its procurement to deliberately create black-owned businesses. So, for example, we recently amended the Preferential Procurement Act by stipulating that 30% of all government projects must be reserved for designated groups, which includes SMMEs. I'm therefore saying one of the first interventions is that reservation must not exclusively focus on small businesses. Even the black-owned businesses that are above the 50 million threshold are still way below the ability to compete with some of the more established businesses, which are typically multinationals or even white-owned in the country. So I'm saying above the 50 million threshold, government must also have a deliberate procurement strategy to ensure that those companies can grow. That's the first intervention.
Okay.
The second intervention is probably to look at framework agreements. So even with respect to the SMMEs, what government is doing at the moment is they bring them onto the procurement fold, but it's a once-off. So Godfrey and Company, because they generate 5 million, they get a project and they get paid, and nobody monitors what happens after that. And that's precisely why we don't have that continuum that I'm talking about. So I'm saying to drive that continuum, you probably need to establish panels where at the onset you identify the small companies, they come onto the procurement system, and you deliberately feed them through a organic growth phase to a point where you can measure the outcomes. There can be a measurable outcome of that policy intervention to say, here's a giant, here's a black-owned company that has been consistently developed over a 5-10 year period, and now they generate 300 million, and they can export their services to the rest of the continent.
Right.
That's the second one. And thirdly, often I think we state organs tend to make the mistake of not understanding the sectors where they procure goods and services. And by that I'm saying, when you go to market, you need to understand the market structure of that sector. Who are the key players? What's the level of concentration in that market? What is the available capability? So that when you do procure, you can actually understand the impact of your procurement policies, both in terms of transformation and developing companies. So I'm saying, supply chain officials must actually go out there and study markets and study sectors, because it's not a one-size-fits-all. In the property sector, you've got a different industry structure, and in entertainment, for example, where you guys operate, the dynamics are different. So you need to precisely understand why I must buy from Power and not the other guy. What is the implication in general terms? The fourth intervention perhaps is really around, once we develop black companies, I think it's also important to ensure that we remain competitive. So being black-owned and being supported through policy interventions by the state does not negate the fact that we still have to drive the issue of competitiveness. We must look for and strive towards building SA businesses that can compete globally.
Absolutely.
So we must not compromise on quality. And the last one perhaps is around, when you develop companies to a significant scale and size, you want to open markets for them beyond the home market. And I think we've seen a lot of the established countries and perhaps China to some degree, that they deliberately open markets for their enterprises.
Yeah.
And I'm saying, going forward, as an inherent policy issue in SA, we need to ensure that we impose South African content on any concessional loan or grant or project that the South African government is involved in another country. We need to ensure that we bring in our South African companies. Right. Pretty much like driving the South African incorporated type of approach, so that we can open markets for our big companies. Okay. That's really the gist of my thinking, Godfrey.
I've got a comment, but there's a caller who also has a comment, and he joins us now. Pastor, what do you want to say?
Godfrey, the biggest problem with the government is that they manage procurement from the supply side. From my position, they must manage procurement from the demand side. They must know what are they going to procure first and create the industrialists irrespective of what they want to do. Because if you know the demand side, you are able to manage the supply side. Instead of the current strategy where they are trying to follow what suppliers require, instead of their demand strategy to procure proactively of addressing the imbalances. I don't know what your guest is saying about that.
Okay, Muzi?
Yes, Godfrey, I think the caller is spot on. Yes, there is often a tendency to look at the supply side. So historically, we've been buying from those 5 or 6 guys. Some of those companies are from Australia or the UK, but that's what we've been doing for the past 10 years, and we'll continue supporting those companies. And that implicitly means that they're ignoring the demand side. Sure. So he is right, and it goes back to my point that they need to understand the market structures in each sector.
Right.
So I fully agree with him.
Okay. Now, my last point was going to be that you're calling for a lot of state intervention here.
Of course. And why? Because the private sector largely is not interested in developing companies. They're looking for mature companies that can deliver the service.
Sure.
This is a social economic transformation issue, and the state, which accounts for about 60% of procurement in the country anyway, probably half of what's spent, has a big role to play.
Yeah.
And that's precisely why I'm focusing my attention on the state.
Muzi, thank you.
Thank you, Godfrey. Thank you for having me.
Muzi Siyaya is Group Development Executive at GIBB Engineering and Architecture. Let's quickly move on to our last story, Engineering and Architecture.